Two men in rags were lounging against the wall of the building on Main Street. A funeral procession came along. It was a celebrity who had passed away, and the men just stared at each other in disbelief. Through the window of that Cadillac hearse, they spied the gleaming golden handles of the polished walnut casket. Elegant floral sprays rested on top. Then came four stretched limousines with an impeccably dressed members of the family. The procession was followed by a long row of luxury cars. The windows were tinted dark. Well, these two spectators, they just stared silently at this dazzling display for that dead man. One of those men in rags, he couldn't contain his astonishment anymore, and he tapped his buddy on the shoulder as the funeral procession drove out of sight. And he murmured, "Man, that's what I call living." James, the writer of the book that we've been studying in the New Testament, he starts off his 5th chapter with the same thoughts. Man, is that ever living? It seems that wealth has a way of making us throw out the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet. And it kind of distorts our perspective, especially if we happen to be poor. Everybody thinks that wealth is the desire and the best thing in life, and it gives you the finest possessions. And if you were wealthy, you're probably the most admired person on the face of the earth. All its creatures would stand up and look at you. Even their funerals leave their mark for fine living. Well, pretend that you're living in that 1st century when James is writing his book. You're struggling for survival. You're under the oppression of the Roman dictators. And you've lost everything. Roman tyranny has driven you from your home. And you've lost everything that you ever owned, all your possessions. And now you're just a new follower in Christ, living now in impoverished, hard circumstances. And you're looking at the wealthy around you, and they seem to be very attractive. These believers, whom James is addressing, they see strange things happening in their little meeting places where they gather to worship. Wealthy individuals, they started attending these services. And these new visitors, they were very envied because they were in a wealthy class. And the poor in the church, they just seemed to fawn all over them. As a result, jealousy arose among the membership. Discrimination set in, and it caused division. The wealthy ones were made even more cocky by the adulation of the poor in their midst. And it seemed that gratitude to God, well, it just disappeared. Dependence on the Lord, well, it was no longer needed. It sort of become dull. Gratitude now, it just flowed to the rich. Well, James, the writer of our book, he watched all this taking place in his congregation. The wealthy visited the meeting places, and the poor were deceived. The wealthy were in a class by themselves, and as a result, they were given special honor because they were the better people. So they thought. And the little church congregations, they watched as it filled up with these big shots. James, the pastor of the little congregation, he sees all this behavior. And here's what he says about it. We're now up at chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. He speaks. You arrogant rich, I have a lesson that I want to teach you, and you're probably not aware of it yet. But there's a crash coming. Your money is corrupt. And your fine clothes, they're going to find themselves in the thrift store. And your greedy luxuries are giving God a pain in the stomach. And it's destroying your life from within. You thought you were piling up wealth. Well, you're not. What you're doing, you're only piling up judgment. That's my translation of those first few verses in James 5. Theodore Roosevelt, he was called Teddy Roosevelt. He was president of the United States at the turn of the last century. He gave a speech in Paris, France, on April the 23rd, 1910. His talk was labeled Man in the Arena. His audience filled an opera house, 2,500. Ministers in court dress. Army and naval officers in full uniform. 900 university students, all special guests, had come to hear the President of the United States. What Roosevelt said in that speech is really what James said to his congregation in the first century. People of superiority, they're really not the strong of society, nor are they as influential as you think. Here's what Roosevelt said about the weakest and the poorest in society. Wealth and intellectual aloofness has nothing on these people in the arena of life. Here's what he told those people in the Paris Opera Hall. It's not the superior who count, who points out how strong he is and how much better he is than others. The real credit belongs to the man in the arena, life, who faces and who's faced the Mars and the dust and the sweat and the blood, who strives valiantly, who keeps failing, and he keeps coming up short again and again, because there's no effort without error, and there's no effort without shortcoming. It's the one who actually strives to do his deeds, who has great devotion, and he spends himself to become worthy. So what if he fails? At least he failed, doing greatly. He doesn't want to be associated with the cold and the timid, those souls who neither know victory nor do they know defeat. What Roosevelt told those Europeans that day, superiority is only an illusion. Weakness always outweighs strength. Luxury can lead to personal comfort. And then we become armchair experts, unwilling to enter life face to face. Roosevelt had never heard of Google. He had never heard of smartphones. Roosevelt never looked into an internet, nor did he know what the name Microsoft meant. But he did know his connection with little people. That's what James did. The man in the arena. Shame on you for thinking that the man on the street is unfit because he does rough work in his workaday world and his hands are all calloused. Get busy, in other words, and start living life alone and alongside these others, learning and listening of what they're teaching you down there in the trenches. Do you know what I'm finding today as a pastor? A lot of families are broken. I find a lot of preachers and churches. They preach watered-down messages I call it sermonettes by preacherettes create Christianettes. The word equity and the word inclusion have now become our watchwords. They have now replaced that strong work ethic that I grew up with. I had to do chores when I was a child. Do you know I'm still doing chores and I'm in my 80s, but I don't mind doing my chores. We're living in a fact-based moral code. That's what it was when I grew up. That was the foundation of our nation. What am I saying? We now have a generation that's growing up that lacks character. Their ability is inhibited. They can't face the flaws they make, nor do they want a remedy to fix them. With that in mind, there's a tendency to criticize the achievements of others. Are you critical? Do you put other people down because you're down? James knew that, and he did a lot of talking about it. What's the answer that James gives? He says, you pursue your attitude of humility. Set aside the superiority. Join the community of others. Learn to belong. Roosevelt would say, jump into the arena. Get into the trenches of real life. Have you ever heard of the sweet spot in sports? Are you a sports fan? Are you a golfer? You ever played ball? How about cricket? You're from over in Britain. Do you ever play tennis? When you hit the ball, I don't think there's anything that feels better than when you strike the ball on the sweet spot of your racket or your bat. It's one of the nicest feelings on earth. And you don't have to swing hard for that ball to fly. And your arm doesn't tingle when you hit it. And the ball doesn't ricochet out of bounds. Hank Aaron. He was the left fielder for the Atlanta Braves in baseball. He broke Babe Ruth's record for the most home runs in baseball. He hit over 700 of them. And Aaron knew all about the sweet spot on his bat. Did you know that he never broke a bat in all his years playing professional baseball? Hank Aaron, he had lots of baseball bats in his career. He only had about 2 or 3 each year when he played for the Braves. And when he was talking to reporters before the game, they would quiz him and ask him, and they said, could you show us where on the barrel of the bat the ball is struck? He said, it's right here. And he showed him the sweet spot. And when they looked at the sweet spot, it was only 4 or 5 inches from the end of the bat, right in the big barrel. You could tell where the sweet spot was because it was there that it had most of the scars. And all the scars of those balls that were hit out of the park, or singles or doubles or triples, each time he hit the ball, that sweet spot on his bat struck the ball no more than a half an inch at any time away from that sweet spot. Now remember, Hank Aaron wasn't a heavy-set man. His swing and his arm strength, it didn't make him look like Hercules. He had the most natural swing in baseball. And what the world found in that baseball world when he retired, he taught them where his sweet spot was and how that ball would fly out of the baseball parks in most stadiums. And they said, what was your secret? He said, my secret was to always swing and repeat my swing each time and make sure the ball was struck on the sweet spot. Well, in life, God's given all of you a sweet spot. I'm not talking about the swinging of a bat or a racket. I'm talking about a secret hiding place in which you live and move. It's like a piece of very expensive sports equipment, tailor-made just for you. And when you find it, life makes sweet sense. When you know your sweet spot, Beethoven only composed one Heiligenstadt overture. Leonardo da Vinci, he only painted one Mona Lisa. Frederick Handel, he finished only one Messiah Symphony. James R. Ryder, living in the past, in that first century, he said, like Peter in 1 Peter 2:5, God's kingdom, God is creating a kingdom of spiritual houses. And if you're a follower of the Lord, you're one of them. Made up of members with sweet spots. That's my translation. Peter said, if anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability which God supplies him with, that in all things God may be glorified through his Son, Jesus Christ. 1 Peter 4:11. Through James, God is telling all of us that we've got an assignment. And along with that business plan, God has also given you the skills to perform it. Are you good with numbers? Why don't you become the church treasurer? That may be your sweet spot. You stare at blueprints. You have no trouble looking at design. Why don't you start building? God may have put that into you as your sweet spot. You love little children. Why don't you start teaching? You love the musical treble clef. You can read it like the back of your hand. Well, why don't you lead the choir? That could become your symphony. I love Matthew 25, verse 15. God gives assignments to people. And here's what he says. To each, according to one's ability. To each, according to one's ability. Did you know that when God calls, he also equips? What is it that you love doing? As you look at your tool chest that you have for your life, what are your affections? What makes you unique? 1 Corinthians 12:7 says, the Spirit has given each of us a special way of serving. And what he's saying, we're serving others. Don't say, I have nothing to offer. You know you have. And you're the special one to give it. So says the Lord. In our study of the 5th chapter of James, he's going to tell those rich folk that have creeped into that meeting place, smarten up. Leave the poor and leave the destitute alone. They're struggling, and they're struggling just to make it. But they belong to me, and I've given them gifts for them to do their job. Here's the Phillips translation of verse 5, James 5. Yes, you wealthy have a magnificent time on this earth, and you have indulged yourself to the full. You've picked out just what you want, just like soldiers looting after the battle. You've condemned, and you've also ruined innocent men in your career. And they've been powerless to stop you. Well, riches are going to prove a liability to you, and you're going to find it's not an asset. It's only going to lead to your selfishness. I've often wondered, who was that doctor in that asylum back in England, there in the 18th century in Britain? One day, he received a patient into his institute who was full of pain and he was full of sorrow. And the man had tried to commit suicide, but he failed. His father was poor. His mother died when he was only 6 years old because she died giving birth to his brother John. The patient's name was William Cowper. He was bullied at school. He didn't look right. One day he fell in love with a pretty girl. But her father denied permission for him to marry her. With that, his life went into a tailspin. He began to suffer depression, and he certainly suffered rejection. Having failed, he tried suicide. And guess what? He failed at suicide too. It didn't work. He still was alive. They brought him to the asylum. The attending physician who received him into that place, he was a Christian doctor. The care that Cowper received was something that he had never experienced before in his life. He had just lost the love of his life. That Christian physician, he told him the love of Jesus. And if he would receive that love, he would be accepted and he would become part of the group. He was told that the Lord could show him his sweet spot. He gave Cowper a Bible before he left, and he led him to Christ. Slowly and steadily, William Cowper began to heal. After almost 8 months, that Christian doctor who led him to the Lord sent him after his relief from the asylum to meet his pastor. Do you know who his pastor was in London? John Newton. Remember that converted slave trader, now preacher, writer of the hymn Amazing Grace? That guy. The two became friends. William Cowper, he didn't know that his sweet spot was going to be hymn writing. He had never written a hymn. He knew poetry. He wrote beautiful hymns. They're in your hymn book. Just a Closer Walk with Thee. That was his. There's a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's vein. That was his. God Moves in Mysterious Ways. That was his. I'm going to close this lesson with Cowper's words from that last hymn, God Moves in Mysterious Ways. Because that's what happened to Cowper. He met his Lord through that Christian doctor, and his whole life changed because of that experience. It could happen to you. Here's what Cowper wrote. You can almost see the pain, but you can also see the conversion. You can see the change. Here he writes, God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea, and he rides upon the storm. You fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy, and they shall break with blessings on your head. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bad may have a better taste and bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Class, I hope you find your flower this week. And in it, I hope you find your sweet spot. And when you do, will you come back next week? James has something more to tell you, and I want to share it with you. So you have a good week, and start looking for your sweet spot.